Hello everyone. In this series we are going to talk about emotion and motivation. So we're not going to get too much into emotion today in part 1, but that'll be coming with part 2 of our lecture, because remember there's going to be 3 components to this week and 3 reading sections. And so we're going to, this unit, and we're going to expand that over the course of the next 2 weeks. So with drive states, we're looking at experiences that are going to guide our behaviors and our thoughts and motivate us to fulfill goals that are beneficial to our survival and reproduction. Those are going to be the key things we're going to look at. So how does our body regulate hunger? How does hunger have a tendency to take over our minds sometimes, right? When we get hangry, for lack of a better word. We're going to look at those different aspects of hunger and how that contributes to the diverting of our attention to other resources, the need to fulfill those goals. We're going to expand on all of that today. We're also going to look at things such as thirst, sexual arousal, and even drug addiction can be a drive state in some sense of the word. But first, our learning objectives for this chapter, number 1, to identify the key properties of drive states. Simply put. Next, we want to describe biological goals accomplished by drive states. Remember, those biological functions are going to drive our drive states, because with drive states, we're seeking to fulfill a need. Give examples of drive states, so we're going to look at different examples. Outline the neurobiological basis of drive states, such as hunger and arousal. Those are the 2 big ones we'll cover in your text. I'm going to provide a little more background into sexual arousal, because there's a lot of research that has occurred in that domain, and it's important to understand kind of where this information is coming from and how we study sexual arousal, especially something that seems so deeply personal to people. Then we're going to look at the neurobiological basis of drive states. I just said that, excuse me. I've not had my coffee this morning, but I'm going to continue on with this video. So, we're also going to look at different parts of the brain that lend themselves to those different states of being and different states of motivation. What parts are more active? What parts, if damaged, can affect those drives? And discuss the main moderators and determinants of drive states such as hunger and arousal. So that's going to look at what can influence that drive state, what kind of cues. We talked about cues previously. They can kind of hint us or prime us into certain directions. That's what we're going to look at. So for our first slide, I know we can't discuss because we're online, but I just want you to think about, what our text questions us with. What is the longest time you have gone without eating? I'm sure you can remember a certain time. Maybe you realize you're hungry right now. How does that make you feel? What kind of emotions run through your head when you're really hungry? What is on your to-do list when you're really hungry? What do you strive to do? And what do you think about? Sometimes that hunger, for example, can overtake any other emotions and kind of put those other circumstances in the back seat, for lack of a better word. For example, if someone invites you out to do something fun, have you ever been so hungry you said, okay, I'll go, but we have to stop somewhere to eat first? Food is going to be the priority, and we're going to discuss the psychological processes and the reason why that is due to our drive states and psychobiological functioning. So with drive states and their key properties, drive states are going to be an affective experience. Affective just means emotion that motivates organisms to fulfill goals that are generally beneficial to their survival and reproduction. So hunger, thirst, those basic functions are all going to be beneficial for our survival. We have internal cues that are going to let us know, hey, it's time to eat. Hey, you need to get some water, right? Stay hydrated. But there's also going to be external cues that play into these drive states. And that has a lot to do with that associative learning that we've discussed previously. So what do you think is an example of a drive state? Keep an open mind. I want you to be able to reflect on this example later, because your discussion post is going to be related to drive states and how it narrows our attention and diverts our attention. But we're going to get there. So the key properties of drive states. Well, first, drive states are going to generate behaviors that result in specific benefits for the body, unlike affective states. So affective states or emotions have a valence. They're either going to be positive or negative, right? And they may encourage us to avoid certain behaviors or engage in other behaviors. Well, drive states are specifically trying to work to get us to engage in a behavior. So a drive state such as hunger is going to have internal and external cues that are going to kind of spark us and motivate us to eat foods. For example, internally, sometimes when we have low blood sugar, that is a signal, internal signal for our body to find a source of carbohydrates. So our hunger is going to direct individuals to eat those foods and increase blood sugar. They're going to generate a behavior that leads us towards an action. Drive states are also going to vary in triggers. So sometimes a drive state may be more determined by internal triggers, so internal biological processes, like hunger and thirst. Like thirst, when there's too much salt in our body, right? We need that water to kind of balance that out. That's very basic biology, and it's not exactly in my domain, but I can tell you it works in general, right? So those internal cues are going to be more automatic, whereas external cues have a lot to do with learning. So for example, if someone is a drug addict, or excuse me, I should say someone who has an addiction to drugs, people first language, there may be external cues that prompt them to engage with that certain drug, right? And that's through associative learning. Maybe they've learned to associate a certain group of people with that particular behavior. Maybe they use their drug of choice at a specific time in the day. Time of day is also an external cue. So it has a lot to do with the learning that's occurred. And so make sure you know the difference between an internal cue and an external cue. And also know that different drive states are going to result in different cognitive and emotional states. So this is basically saying that you're going to have different feelings about different drive states. Some may be more salient than others. Some may be more overpowering than others. I know for me, hunger is a predominant drive state, right? If I'm hungry, I can't think about anything else or anyone else. I become very selfish and I am motivated to get that food. But maybe thirst isn't as prominent of a drive state for me. There's going to have different cognitive emotional states. I may think about things differently than you, for example. And homeostasis is just this idea that our body is trying to maintain a balance. So I have said this repeatedly, but with those drive states, think of your body. I'll use this example on the next slide, but we're trying to maintain a balance between our biological functions for our survival. And drive states are also going to have a narrowing of attention. We are going to divert our cognitive resources to satisfying this need, and it's kind of going to overtake our conscious cognitions, right? We're focused on it. We want to get that food. We want to sate that hunger need. Now, homeostasis, you may have heard this before if you've taken any biology class, right? Is defined by the tendency of an organism to maintain stability across different physiological symptoms in the body. So, this is maintaining your body temperature, for example. If your body temperature is too high, your body is going to work to fight that fever and bring that temperature down, and vice versa. And this is going to be maintained by key factors. Your homeostasis has a set point for different processes in the body. Your set point is just this ideal level. And your body is going to consistently analyze its processes to ensure that we're around that set point in order to function well. So if your temperature is too high, your body is going to realize that and work to bring it back to that set point. There are a bunch of different mechanisms through which to do this, depending on what process we're looking at. But an example of this in real life is think about your thermostat in your house if you have central heating and air. So if you turn on a thermostat, let's say I want it at 72 in my house. Well, if it exceeds that temperature at 72, the air conditioning is going to kick on to bring that temperature back down to 72. and it's going to be consistently monitoring the air around it to ensure that it's at the appropriate temperature. Well, on the vice versa, if it falls to 60, if it's consistently assessing the temperature of my house, and it finds that the house is at 60 and that's not at the set point I wanted, it's going to use the heat to get it back up to that set point. So think of our body, that process of homeostasis, as similar to the thermostat in your home. A lot of these processes, again, are automatic and unconscious. We don't have to think about our temperature to bring it down. We think about too many things enough as it is, so I think that would just be really inhibiting for some people. But also immune responses. When you get sick, your body's consistently monitoring your viral loads, in a sense, and it's going to build the appropriate immune responses. If you contract a virus or a sickness, it tends to fight it off to get you back to that set point or balance. And sometimes homeostasis involves a deliberate action. So with hunger, for example, hunger can give you severe pains in your stomach, right? It can affect you physiologically, and it's almost like a punisher that our body is bringing out, like, hey, I need food. How dare you not give me food? And so in moving to the set point, our homeostasis, that process, that hunger is a punishment for not sating our needs. So there is going to be, once we find that food, we are going to find pleasure in moving to the set point. Because when you eat after you've been so hungry, it tastes so good. And the same works with heat or cold. If your body temperature has fallen below, it feels really good to come inside into the warm. So that sense of pleasure is going to be associated with moving towards that set point. Now, with the narrowing of attention, let's get into this detail about drive theory, and as I've learned it back in the day, drive reduction theory. So we seek to do things that are going to reduce our drive. Typically, what we find is that when we narrow our attention, this can be done in 3 different ways. It's going to be directing our attention towards elements that satisfied that drive, collapsing a sense of time, and basically being more selfish. The attention is going to come to ourself. So let's go with number 1. As drive states intensify, they direct attention toward elements, activities, and forms of consumption that satisfy the biological needs associated with that drive. So what does that mean? Our attention, like when our friend asks us to go out before we've eaten, we may say, hey, I really need to eat first. Let's stop at McDonald's and we can go. So we're directing our attention, even though we're kind of thinking about our present plans, we're shaping them so that we address that biological need first. So the activities and everything, sometimes you may even find that the hunger is consuming your thoughts in a sense. That's because it's trying to satisfy that need and direct your attention to say, hey, I need this food, get me that food. And let's bring it to the full attention of our brains. And with that, outcomes and objects not related to food lose their value. So we don't see them as priorities. So if you really wanted to go out with your friend, but you didn't eat and you're really, really, really hungry, we keep using that example, that outcome of going out with your friend is not as important as you fulfilling that biological need. And that's speaking as a norm, generally speaking, of course. For example, think about if anyone ever invited you out when you were hungry. I know I would do the exact thing that we are talking about with the narrowing of attention. Food takes the priority. Now, we are also going to look at how time seems to collapse towards the present. We don't have as much foresight and ability to look into the future as well, because we are so focused on what is happening right now with our bodies. We become impatient. And so I use the word hangry because I feel like that's common kind of slang. You get angry when you're hungry, but it's true. We get very impatient because time is harder to assess in the future. We're so focused on the now. And an important study that we looked at, which I'm going to address in the next slide, was this Ariely and Lowenstein that was listed in our text in 2006. It was looking at how a drive state of sexual arousal can affect our concerns for the future, and also how we make decisions, right? Because if you're impatient, you may make rash decisions. If you're hangry and you're willing to eat anything, you might eat something that felt good in the moment, but after you're like, oh, I didn't really enjoy that. I was just really hungry, so it tasted better, right? Same can be said for sexual arousal under drive state. How do we look at concerns for the future? How do we maintain that foresight in situations when our drive states may become so overwhelming? And also think of the thoughts and outcomes related to the self versus the others. We become very selfish. This undermines our sense of altruism or doing good for others without the sense of reward, because that need is so overpowering. I can't say it enough. I know I say it a lot, but it's just to emphasize that point of how it consumes us. And so it's going to consume your thoughts, your activities, your emotions, how you perceive time, what's most important, how you prioritize, and also who you prioritize. Maybe you're generally a selfless person, but if you are hungry, stay out of the way, because you need to find that food and you need to find it now. Now, with Ariely and Lowenstein, their study was called The Heat of the Moment. That was part of the study. And what it was looking at was to see how a sexually aroused drive state can affect sexual decision making. And I think this was an important study to emphasize for you all. I included a link on the previous slide with the name, because our text briefly glances over it, but it demonstrates the implications that the drive states have on future behaviors, and even, pro-social or aggressive behaviors. And it can even change our affectivity, how we think about scenarios. They're totally going to change it in our minds. So in this example for this study, what they did was each participant, I forgot the number of participants they had, but each participant was asked to kind of rate these questions on a sliding scale from 0 meaning no to 100 meaning yes. So their answers are going to vary all along that spectrum. Now, it was a study of undergraduate men who were given a laptop to conduct this study in their own place of residence. And they were asked to induce a state of arousal, whatever means that was necessary for them to induce a state of sexual arousal, depending on the group they were assigned. So if non-aroused, they were asked these questions, they had to answer these questions. They were part of the aroused group, they were asked to self-stimulate to get to a point of sexual arousal. And then they were asked different questions. And these differences are quite large in some categories. I'll take it here. For non-aroused male participants, when asked would they find it exciting to have anal sex, 46 was the average rating, so leaning a bit more towards no. But when the participants were in an aroused state, 77, it was more towards 77. That is a 31-point difference, more towards the side of yes. So if you look through these questions, you'll see how different the responses are based on the aroused state. And these can be attributed to our inability to see foresight and the need to satisfy that drive. So, for example, let's do another one with a large difference. It says, can you imagine having sex with a 50-year-old woman? I presume the men in this study were of heterosexual orientation. 28 was the average rating for non-aroused males. So most of them leaning towards no. Aroused males, on the other hand, had a rating of 55, so leaning more towards yes. And that's a bit more demonstrative of the types of cognitions and thoughts these people were having in this aroused state, because of how much it consumes those thought patterns, directs them towards satiating this need, and gives them limited perspective on the future. And so if you're interested, again, I've included the link, but you can look at all of these different categories, and comparing the non-aroused group to the aroused group, there are quite some large differences. Like, would it be fun to tie up your sexual partner? 47 for non-aroused group, 75 for the aroused group. Anyway, I just thought these were really interesting. But so these are questions asking these participants, hey, how would you feel about this scenario, right? We're not the best at self-reporting sometimes, but it also looked at behaviors. So sometimes these response, how these men think they would act in certain scenarios. And this can kind of clue us into certain motivating factors behind the drive states, and how much sometimes people will put that at the forefront of their mind, accomplishing that behavior, but at what cost. So for example, disclaimer, there is talk of rape in this questionnaire, so if you've had any like traumatizing experiences with that, I just want you to know before reading this. But it was talking about, would you slip a woman a drug to increase the chance that she would have sex with you? In the non-aroused group, men rated this as a 5, so that was very, very far on the side of no. In the aroused group, it was rated 26. While that's still mostly leaning towards no, that is a large jump between non-aroused participants and aroused participants. Even, would you keep trying to have sex after your date says no? Non-aroused, 20. Aroused, 45. So this study has a big implication in understanding how drive states can overtake even logic in some processes, and things we know that we wouldn't traditionally do. But in the aroused states, it may direct us in some way. Not saying we're out of control like some kind of animal, but it does influence our thought processes and behavior. So check out that study if you get a chance.